Hello, dear friends. We are going to do a discussion of Michel Foucault's theories. This video is part of the New Historicism video series. You must have already watched the first one. As I have already explained in the first video, New Historicism is heavily dependent on Foucauldian theories. Every one of us has struggled at some point with Michel Foucault. Foucault's theories are very difficult to understand and teach because there is nothing called Foucault's theory. Foucault himself did not explain many of the things that are part of Foucauldian theory. It was his commentators who explained. He just brought forth ideas and concepts, and he did not fall into any movement or category easily. That is Michel Foucault. Foucault deliberately stood outside the canon of literary theory and philosophy. And he refused to fix his concepts or define his concepts in easy ways. So much more difficult for us. Now, Foucault stood against traditional theory also. He criticized Derrida and such theoreticians, and he advocated the approach called archaeology to history. At first, he talked about archaeology, and then eventually he revised it and developed the concept of genealogy. We will talk about that now. At first, it was in the early 1970s that he advocated what is called archaeology. The early 1970s. Well, you know that traditional historians pretend that history is a unified entity. Traditional historians believe that history is unified. It is one homogeneous story. There are no fissures or gaps in history. If there are any gaps or things that we don't know or understand, the traditional historian will cover it up with the story of history. What the traditional historians did was take evidence from history. Evidence. Historical evidence like books or people's documents or monuments or artifacts from the past. All these documents is actual historical evidence that they took and studied. Inevitably, these documents did not present a unified story. Inevitably, there were gaps and fissures. Everything, all the documents did not fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. There were many gaps, like the gaps on a bookshelf. These gaps, the old historians did not focus on. They ignored it. They did not understand these gaps. And when they studied the documents of history, they ignored these gaps. And what did they do? They threw over these documents the blanket of history, covering these gaps. And it looked like there are no gaps or fissures. It looked like history is unified. Did you understand? Traditional history or old historians presented one story of history as if it really happened, covering up all the inconsistencies and gaps. The story of history they made, it was not real. It was partly fiction. This story of history they made and put over the documents. They covered up the documents so that it looked like there is no discontinuity in history. It looked like there are no gaps, there is no discontinuity, there are no fissures. There are no silences. It looked like history is one continuous story. Our Michel Foucault is against this idea. Michel Foucault does not support the idea that history is continuous and homogeneous. Foucault believes that history has gaps. Foucault focuses on the gaps. And he believes in history as archive. And what do you mean by that? History as archive. For easy understanding, I can say this is a very famous example. History is like the book stacks in a library. In a library stack, there will be many missing books. There will be many spaces in between. It won't be a continuous array of books always. That you can see in this picture. Isn't it like that? History is also full of discontinuities and gaps. Foucault's archival approach to history gave importance to the gaps and discontinuities. You should rediscover the struggles of the past. These gaps are the struggles of the past. You should rediscover the struggles of the past. You should highlight the struggles, the gaps, the silences, the omissions of history. You should not fill up these gaps with fiction. You should not put over them the blanket of history. So, Foucault's approach to history, which New Historicism borrowed, is actually questioning old historicism. It is questioning Foucauldian approach, and New Historicism is questioning old historicism, and New Historicism is anti-establishment. We can say Foucauldian approach to history goes against the overarching meta-narratives of history. The blanket of history is the meta-narrative of history. New Historicism is against it. Foucault is against it. Foucault goes against the overarching meta-narratives of history. It goes against the ways in which power works on history and makes a grand narrative out of it. The powerful people will come and fill the gaps with fiction. They will create one story of history that suits their purpose. New Historicism does not like that. As you know, many of Foucault's ideas, like the panoptic surveillance state, or discourse, or episteme, or power knowledge, etc., are all very important in understanding the Foucauldian approach to history. I will discuss all these terms, don't worry. Panoptic surveillance state, discourse, episteme, power knowledge, everything I will discuss. These are all ways in which Foucault questioned old kinds of history. Foucault questioned old kinds of history, and he questioned the old perceptions of criminality, psychiatry, sexuality, etc., that followed the old historicist approach. Foucault questioned the old historicist approach to discourses like sexuality, criminality, psychiatry. Is that clear? Now, a very important concept of Foucault is that of discourse. I guess everybody knows that. Don't worry, I will explain. Discourse is related to power knowledge. A very important concept in Foucault is discourse as well as power knowledge. How power knowledge becomes a discourse. Power bar knowledge. That is how Foucault wrote it. Foucault talked about how power works in the society. How power works on subjects in the society. Now, Foucault is against the idea. He questioned the idea, the age-old idea. What idea? That power works from the top to the bottom. Foucault questioned the idea that power always works from top to the bottom. Here, in Foucault, power is everywhere. Foucault said that in a society, power is everywhere. It works in capillary modes, like our blood vessels and capillaries. It works in capillary modes or capillary formations. The lower strata also exert power. The powerless people also exert power. Power is everywhere. For example, look at a family. It is not only the father exerting power on the mother and the children, but in some ways the mother exerts power. In other ways, children exert power. Very subtly sometimes, very indirectly sometimes, but power is there everywhere in the structure. Power is ubiquitous. Power is ubiquitous, means everywhere. It is found everywhere. It is something that reaches the very grain of individuals. Hello, you have power. Just realize it. It's within you. Power is within you. It's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. You can't say I am powerless. You can't say I am a victim. Because even the victim exerts a certain kind of power, the power of resistance upon the oppressor. Even the powerless people have some kind of power, though they should realize it and exert it. It is that everybody has some power. We have to realize it, and we have to see how power reaches into the very grain of our individual minds and inserts it into all our actions. There is nothing that escapes power relationships. Power constitutes subjects. It establishes institutions and controls subjects. Religion, education, law, gender, fashion, everything controls us. Power produces forms of knowledge, and knowledge in turn modifies, redistributes, and stabilizes categories of power. See, this beautiful image I got from the internet. So, power defines us. Power is there in the very grain of individuals. It's like ideology. Like power, Foucauldian power, Althusserian concept of ideology is all pervasive. Ideology also defines us. Power is there in our knowledge systems, in our learning processes. It is there in our politics. It is there in our education, all the institutions of the society. It is there in our daily lives. You know, that is why cultural studies is all about popular culture and daily life, because there is a lot of power at work there. Both oppressive power as well as subversive power. Resistance power, subversive power, that's also power. So, power, knowledge, it exists together. It constitutes subjects. It establishes institutions, controls. Knowledge redefines, modifies, redistributes power. Power in turn produces knowledge. Power and knowledge go hand in hand. It's everywhere. Now, this is related to Foucault's concept of history as archive. History as archive means what? History is like the book stacks in a library. History is discontinuous. This kind of history as archival or discontinuous is where power works hand in hand with knowledge. In his discussions of sexuality, for example, in the book History of Sexuality, you must have heard of that. Foucault, in the History of Sexuality, talks about sexuality. In his discussions on sexuality, in his discussions on criminality, in which book? Discipline and Punish. Criminality and Punishment. And also in the other book, The Order of Things. In these books, Foucault discussed power not as a dividing power or a dividing practice, as dividing powerful people from the powerless people. No. But that is not how he talked about power. But he moved towards a more positive conception of power. Power is not dividing. Power is not dividing the powerful people on top, powerless people on the bottom. Not like that. Power is more positive. It is productive. Foucault understood power as positive and productive. It is there in all of us. It produces our identities. It produces us. Power is a hybrid form containing within it aspects of pleasure, aspects of knowledge, aspects of action and subversion, and so on and so forth. Power produces pleasure, knowledge, action, and subversion. With that background knowledge of power knowledge, let me now explain the concept of archaeology. The term archaeology appeared in many of the early books of Foucault. The term archaeology appeared in many of the early books of Foucault, such as The Birth of the Clinic. First, actually, he wrote Order of Things. The Order of Things, an Archaeology of the Human Sciences. It came in 1970. Remember that year. And then The Birth of the Clinic, an Archaeology of Medical Perception. 3 years later, in 1973. So he is using archaeology in all the titles. Why? Archaeology was a very pet idea that Foucault used in many of his early titles. What was archaeology? Archaeology for Foucault was his term to denote the research and analysis of history. The research and analysis of history. By digging into the past, uncovering the discursive elements of the past. Foucault talked about history, the discursive elements of history of the past, through the word archaeology, the discontinuous elements of the past, all the conflictual, fragmented elements of the past. These fragmented elements of the past became the documents for the old historian, isn't it? The fragmented elements of the past, the discontinuous elements of the past, became the documents which the historians work on. What do the historians do? They look at these documents or evidence from the past. These are discontinuous, fragmented. The historians rearrange them, work with them, not in any hierarchical manner, but in a structural manner. What does the Foucauldian historian do? He does not throw over these documents of history, a story of history, a homogeneous blanket of history. He does not use. Then what does he do? Without a hierarchical manner, he just looks at the documents in a structural manner, focusing on the documents themselves rather than create an overarching story out of it. The Foucauldian historian focuses on the documents, the discontinuities of the documents. He does not hide the gaps and discontinuities under a homogeneous story. Whereas the old historians covered up the gaps. The Foucauldian historian studies these documents structurally, organizing the documents, organizing the evidence of history, dividing them up, reorganizing them, defining unities and relations in these documents. That is what he does. Defining them, dividing them, reorganizing them, and thus history becomes discontinuous. It becomes evolving, becoming. There is no finished product in Foucauldian history. Foucault was thus advocating a very new approach to the evidence of history, to the documents of history. Foucault was advocating a totally new approach to the documents of history. Foucauldian conception of history is that it is discontinuous, no longer something that the historian has to explain and unify. Thus, discontinuity becomes a positive element. These gaps or discontinuities become a positive element in Foucault, where history's objectives are found and validated. It is in these discontinuities that history's objectives are found. It is not in the homogeneous story that the old historians made up. History becomes a discourse. History becomes a whole way of talking about something. History becomes an institutionalized way of thinking. The discourse of history is formed only when we focus on the discontinuities. When history is a discourse, it has its own language, it has its own perspectives, and that discourse defines you. You can't escape it, you exist within it. And what is the peculiarity of discourse? It is never unified. It is always fragmented. Did you understand? Now, to explain the concept of discourse, there are so many examples we can give. Like sexuality. Sexuality is a discourse. It is not one unified story. It is a discontinuous set of documents. Or psychiatry, or criminality, or terrorism, nationalism, gender. Any number of examples we can give. These are all discourses. They are discontinuous. They are not meta-narratives. They are all discontinuous elements or entities which become a way of thinking. These discourses procure its own language. They have a certain language associated with them. These discourses get institutionalized very easily. That is the problem with discourse. Discourse is discontinuous, fragmented, but easily they will get institutionalized because it is a way of thinking, a way of speaking. A discourse procures its own language. A discourse is a system of thought. A discourse is a system of thought composed of ideas, attitudes, causes of action. A discourse will have its own ideas, its own ways of thinking, its own attitudes, its own causes of action, beliefs and practices. It's like a world in itself. Discourse is a system of thought composed of ideas. Think of nationalism, for example. When you are within the discourse of nationalism, that discourse defines what you think about India. You are not free to think whatever you want. The discourse of nationalism defines what you should think about India, what you should think about the national language Hindi. It defines what you should think about Hindus and Muslims, what you think about religion, and so on and so forth. Nationalism defines you. It defines your way of thinking. It gives you a language. Nationalism as a discourse is composed of ideas, attitudes. Are you following me? Nationalism as a discourse contains its own ideas, attitudes, causes of action. And what happens? Anybody who thinks against these ideas or attitudes of nationalism become an anti-national. That is how every discourse works. And even if you are a nationalist, let me tell you this. Even if you are a nationalist, that does not mean you should completely accept what the ruling party says. Or it does not mean that you should completely accept certain communities are as great. You need not completely accept that certain communities are bad. Why? Even though nationalism gives you one language, you need not accept. Why? Because nationalism is not one homogeneous thing. Nationalism within itself, within the discourse of nationalism, it is diverse. It is fragmented, very multiple, very plural. Foucault is showing how discourses are fragmented and diverse and multiple, but they become oppressive. That is what Foucault is showing. Even though discourses are by nature fragmented and multiple and plural, discourses become oppressive. Discourses eventually silence us. It deny us freedom. Discourses deny us freedom. Discourses wipe out the plurality. It works against itself. So, Foucault points out that we should continually question discourses. Discourses should be continually questioned. A discourse is so comprehensive that everything outside the discourse becomes meaningless and negative. A discourse has that power of negating everything that is outside it. These are all examples. Now, what makes knowledge? Knowledge. It is the episteme. It was in the book The Order of Things that Foucault talked about the episteme, and he made an epistemological study of discourses. Foucault talked about the episteme and made an epistemological study of discourses. Remember, in The Order of Things, published in 1970. He studied epistemologically about biology or life, about economics or labor, about linguistics or language. Did you understand? In The Order of Things, he studied biology, which is actually life, study of life. He studied economics, which is actually study of labor. He studied linguistics, which is the study of language. And Foucault also looked at how in the Renaissance period, and after that in the classical period, and in the modern period, first Renaissance period, then what we call neoclassical period, then the modern period. In these periods, what happened? These ideas changed drastically. Which ideas? Biology, economics, language, or linguistics. Life it was at first. Later it became biology. Language it was at first. Later it became linguistics. Labor it was at first. Later it became economics. How did these changes happen? Because of what is called episteme. Clear? Now what is an episteme? Before I come to this, what is an episteme? Episteme is the a priori of knowledge. Have you heard of a priori? It's a very common word in philosophy from Immanuel Kant. A priori means a preconceived idea. Episteme is the a priori of knowledge. That means episteme is the preconceived idea that we have in our mind that makes us accept some things as knowledge. Did you understand? We accept certain things as knowledge and certain things as not knowledge. Why? Because we have an episteme in our mind. I think you didn't get it. Let me give you a silly example. Suppose there is a boy who wants to get married and he meets this girl. One girl and one boy. They start talking to get to know each other. The boy asks the girl, "What do you do?" And the girl says, "I'm learning to fold clothes." The boy asks the girl, "What do you do?" And the girl says, "I'm learning to fold clothes." What? That is not knowledge. The boy is confused. Then he says, "Oh, are you in the hospitality industry? Because in hotels, etc., you should know how to fold clothes, right? Do you work in a hotel? Or are you doing a hospitality course? Probably MBA in hospitality?" The girl says, "No, I am at home, just learning to fold clothes." Array, something is seriously wrong. We think this is not normal. Why? Because folding clothes outside the hospitality industry is not considered a knowledge these days, isn't it? It is not considered a knowledge. Why are certain things considered knowledge and why is folding clothes not considered knowledge? Because of the a priori of understanding, the preconceived notions of knowledge called episteme. Did you understand? Folding clothes is not knowledge, whereas other household things like cooking, probably may be considered knowledge. My passion is cooking and I'm learning cooking sounds more acceptable than my passion is folding clothes or washing clothes. These days, if somebody specializes in washing clothes, except if he or she is in the laundry industry, you think there is something wrong because you don't need them to do that. Because washing clothes is not knowledge anymore. Why? Because you can just buy a washing machine. That's why. So, like that, in every period, there are certain things accepted as knowledge. Did you understand? To explain this, a very famous example is Jorge Luis Borges. Jorge Luis Borges, can you see? He he wrote about a fictitious taxonomy of animals. He described a fictitious taxonomy of animals in his 1942 essay, The Analytical Language of John Wilkins. Here, he's talking about a Chinese encyclopedia called Celestial Emporium of Benevolent Knowledge. In this encyclopedia, animals are classified in weird ways. Animals are classified like this. Those belonging to the emperor. Okay. Embalmed animals. They are not even animals because they should be dead. Next is trained animals. Suckling pigs. Wow, that is another category. Mermaids. That is not an animal. Fabled animals. That means what? Animals about whom there are fables. Now, you can't accept that. Another category is stray dogs. What? Is this a scientific classification? This looks so stupid. Those included in this classification, that is another category. Funny. Those that tremble as if they were mad. Oh my God, something is seriously wrong with this encyclopedia. Innumerable ones. Those drawn with a very fine camel hair brush. Come on. This is a joke. Etc. Oh, that is also a category. Those that have just broken the vase. Wow. Those that from afar look like flies. What kind of crazy guy made this category, you are wondering. This encyclopedia, Chinese encyclopedia that Borges talked about, is the most famous heterotopia that appears in Foucault's work. Heterotopia. What is a heterotopia? It's a many-layered space. A space that has many layers of meanings. A space that has many layers of relationships. A heterotopia is a space where epistemes overlap and clash. Knowledges or a priori of knowledges overlap and clash in a heterotopia. What is meant by episteme? Episteme means study of knowledge. Epistemology means study of knowledge or history of knowledge. And knowledges clash in heterotopia, creating layers of meanings and relationships. Clear? This is a heterotopia, where many knowledges clash, where many epistemes clash. Foucault, in the order of things, studies knowledges. I mentioned this already. Knowledges of the Renaissance period, classical period, and modern period. He studied Renaissance and found that the Renaissance period categorized knowledge based on resemblance. In the Renaissance period, knowledge is organized around resemblance, similarity or resemblance. In the classical period, there is representation and categorization instead. In the classical period, there is representation and categorization. And that gave rise to science. When you start to represent and categorize, it becomes science. In the Renaissance period, literature, for example, is based on life or similarity or life-likeness. Literature here is very close to life. However, in the classical period or neoclassical period, they begin to categorize scientifically. They begin to categorize knowledges, literature, etc. scientifically. At this time, taxonomy developed, representation developed, a scientific language developed. It is not based on resemblance. During the classical period, in France and England, I mean the neoclassical period, the 17th and 18th centuries, some social classes are represented in a certain way. Some people are represented in a certain way. English culture is represented in a certain way as the culture of the true-born Englishman, while French culture is represented in a certain other way as very negative. Categorization. You can see that in Gulliver's Travels, for example. Categorization, that is the basis of science. In the modern episteme, the centrality is on man. What is man like? Who is man? What are the many ways in which man engages in society and culture? Are you following me? Modernity focuses on man. Late 19th, 20th centuries. In the Renaissance episteme, what was categorized as life took the form of natural history in the neoclassical episteme, and in the modern period it became the science of biology. The science of biology had its roots in the natural history of the neoclassical period. Similarly, in the case of labor, what was considered labor in the neoclassical episteme became what is the science of wealth in the what was considered labor in the Renaissance episteme became the science of wealth in the neoclassical episteme, and today in the modern period it is economics, the science of economics. Today the word income is more acceptable than wealth, isn't it? If somebody says, I have a pretty good income, you appreciate him. If somebody says, I'm pretty wealthy, you will think, what? What a boastful bloke, you will think. Economics is acceptable. And income is acceptable. In the case of language, what was in the Renaissance episteme language, in the neoclassical episteme became general principles of grammar. In the 18th century, language was given up and the concept of grammar took over. In the modern episteme, it became the advanced science of linguistics. Did you understand? Now look at this. The structural patterns that link the aspects of life. The structural patterns that link the aspects of life in the modern period. In order to understand biology, we need a synchronic study. We need to study all the animals and birds that exist at this time. We don't need a diachronic study. Synchronic similarities. Similarities of animals that exist at this particular period. Synchronic similarities in the discipline become more important and more apparent than diachronic similarities. You will understand with linguistics. You study language as it exists today. History is there. Diachronics is important, but synchronics is more important. Studying contemporary animals is more important than studying ancient animals. Foucault pointed out that synchronic associations are important in all these sciences. In economics, biology, linguistics, we talk synchronically. Now, Foucault's understanding of history is almost always related to the history of the present. Foucault's understanding of history is associated with what is called the history of the present. The effective history of the present. That is how it is called. The effective history of the present. What does that denote? The erratic and discontinuous process by which the present became the present. Foucault, by the history of the present, refers to the erratic and discontinuous process. Remember, history as archive. the discontinuous process by which the present became the present. See, history of the present does not mean how the present developed from the past. That is diachronic approach. History of the present does not mean how the present developed from the past. Rather, it means how the present developed from discontinuous processes. He talks about how discourses came into being, not in a diachronic manner, but in a synchronic manner. How the present discourses came into being, how the present discourse of sexuality came into being, how the present discourse of psychiatry came into being, how present criminality came into being. They are all based on synchronic epistemological connections. They are not based on history of the past. They are based on epistemological present connections. The development of the history of the present is related to Foucault's terms archaeology and genealogy. These are two important terms, archaeology and genealogy. Foucault's Discipline and Punish is the book that marked his development from archaeology to genealogy. In Foucault's Discipline and Punish, he developed archaeology into genealogy. Before that, he was talking only about archaeology. If archaeology is about how a discourse is developed or created, genealogy is about how the human being is created within that discourse. If archaeology is about how a discourse is developed or created, genealogy is about how a human being is created within that discourse. Did you understand?